Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Powder, or Jinx, from the TV show of Arcane.
Hi.
Some really quick disclaimers before we get too far into this. I can't technically diagnose fictional characters from games or TV shows, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about general mental health concepts or overall themes. Also, I have never played League of Legends, so I can't talk about how Jinx is shown in the game. I'm really going to focus on the TV show because that's what I've seen. I also want to put out there that just because this is how I talk about mental health concepts or what I have seen or noticed from the show, it doesn't mean that this is the only way that mental health shows up. Other mental health professionals may talk about mental health in a different way or notice other things. You may have noticed other things, and that is completely fine. In my mind, this just opens up the door for more conversations about mental health, which is always fantastic. I'm going to be talking about the entire show of Arcane and not like specific moments or specific incidents, basically. So what I'm saying is, if you have not finished the show, please go watch it and come back. Otherwise, there's going to be spoilers. I do not want to be the bringer of spoilers. Finish the entire show, please. And thank you. This is also going to only focus on two overall mental health themes when it comes to Jinx. Basically, trauma and psychosis. There's going to be a second video that focuses on other mental health elements, so keep that in mind. One of the biggest things that I feel like the TV show of Arcane is really hitting home, really focusing on, is trauma. I mean, there's an episode titled The Monster You Created. They really lean into the idea of trauma. I mean, the opening scene is the bridge where Vi and Powder lost their parents. When we lose our parents from such an early age, I think it's pretty safe to consider that that can be traumatic. But I do want to back up for a second. I feel like it's important to make sure that we're on the same page about like what trauma is, what that means, because I feel like our society talks about trauma as though it's an event that we experience, but I don't feel like that's accurate. Trauma is more about our response to something that is big or scary. So it's more about our response to an event, how we process an event, and not the event itself. That also means that trauma is subjective, so you can have two people who experience the same event or the same kind of event, and one might process it as trauma and the other might not process it as trauma, and that's fine. But the reason why I feel like that's important to add is because if I am talking about a fictional character like Jinx or Powder, I'm kind of really guessing about, well, this could have been traumatic for this character. And so that's why I feel like it's important to add that trauma is subjective. I'm really making an educated guess based on the situations that we saw happening and Jinx's emotional reactions, that kind of thing. It feels not great. If I were to say this is for sure traumatic, that kind of hits the same place for me as if I were to say you feel angry. I don't like that, so that's why I feel like adding that trauma is subjective. The show does start off though. The very first thing that we see is a situation that is probably traumatic. We see her at a very early age in her life, walking through chaos and death and mayhem. We know that this is where her parents died, so it's not just death, it's where safety would have died for her. It's where her entire life would have changed from here on out. That seems like it would be traumatic. And not only that, the scene has her with her eyes covered, and we can't know whether that's something that her parents told her to do or Vi told her to do, but why would we tell a child to cover their eyes unless we knew that it was going to be scary, or they shouldn't be seeing that, or it was probably going to be traumatic? And I want to put a pin in this idea, or this moment, or this scene. Imagine a pin. There's a pin there. Because I want to come back to this. I feel like this moment in the show has huge implications that gets overlooked fairly easily, and I didn't even notice it until my second watch. From this moment in time, her entire life changed because her family structure had to change. She was taken in by Vander. Vi became like a second parent to her, and she had these siblings who were around her, and they did shenanigans, right? But the biggest thing that stands out to me about this situation is the fact that within this family, this new adoptive family, Powder essentially became the family scapegoat. If something went wrong, her siblings seemed to blame Powder. Not everybody in the family really blamed Powder. Vi didn't seem to blame Powder, and Vander didn't seem to blame Powder. But the rest of her siblings did. The thing with family roles is that it feels like a lot of stereotypes. So if I'm the scapegoat in my family, it basically is what it sounds like. This stuff has a real impact on us, especially over time, and especially when this is our family. If I'm always blamed for whatever goes wrong in my family, whether it's my fault or not, I'm gonna start to expect that everything that goes wrong in almost all of my life is always my fault. regardless of whether it comes from my family, regardless of if it's actually my fault or not, I'm gonna have a different idea of what it means for something to be my fault. I'm gonna just start expecting negative things to come my way. Like, this stuff has a real impact on us. That was Powder's role in her family. They always called her a Jinx. Everything that went wrong, that had nothing to do with her. She had no idea what those crystals were going to do, but she got the blame for it. And they talk about it as though this was like a common thing that would happen as far as blaming Powder. Powder became the scapegoat in this family. Everything that went wrong was somehow her fault, unless it came from Vander or Vi. Vi seemed to be more protective, and she tried to be more supportive of Powder, which seemed to mean that they had a closer relationship. But otherwise, Powder got shit in this family, especially from her other siblings. Think about it this way. If you look at a word and you don't have a positive thing that immediately comes to your mind, it's probably not a word that we want to be associated with. And when I think of the word Jinx, I don't think of great things with it. It's usually like a bad thing. We don't want to be Jinx. It's like a curse, right? And so the fact that that was always what her family called her, that can be traumatic over time. Trauma does not have to be one big incident. Trauma can be small things that happen over time. Trauma can also be things that we don't get. So if we don't get support, if we don't get unconditional love from our family, these things can also be traumatic. Arcane really hits home that moment in between Vi and Powder in the alley, where Powder is really crying and she's just asking her sister for acceptance and love. She just wants that connection in that moment. That seems to be a huge thing that the show goes back to, I guess. But I think that there's an earlier point in the show that really leads up to that. Like, why would Powder be so desperate for Vi's love and acceptance unless something happened earlier? So I feel like there's trauma that led up to that moment that made that moment so significant for Powder. Powder had spent, we can assume, years being the scapegoat of her family. So she had spent years being shit on in subtle ways by people that she loved and cared for, and that's trauma. Not only that, but Vi didn't do that. Vi was supportive. Vi took her out and told her stories about how her siblings made just as many mistakes as she did, told her that she was human for making mistakes, had that unconditional love and acceptance that we want from a parent, which is not Vi's job. Vi is her sister, but she still got that from Vi. Vi really hit home this idea that just because you are different does not mean that is bad. Like, that kind of unconditional love and acceptance Powder got from her sister. But then Vi told her to stay home. And I think that was traumatic in its own way. We have her sister who told her amazing things, who really supported her. One of the few people who was supporting her in this family. That was Vi's way of protecting her. But what I think happened, Powder felt betrayed by Vi. It was like a 180, because up until that moment, she was being encouraged by her sister. It's like, yes, I'm growing, I'm helping, I'm doing good things. And then her sister's like, no, you're not. And there wasn't an explanation. There wasn't a conversation about it. She wasn't told something like, this is how you're helping. This is a different kind of helping. Maybe that could have been heard a little better by Powder. I feel like Powder just heard, we're gonna leave you, and that's it. I think that was really traumatic. I think that moment is what made the moment in the alley so hard for her, because that's when we really start seeing Powder start to become so emotional. That's when she really starts crying the same way that she did in the alley. That was the beginning of it. It was when she felt like her sister was leaving her. And to feel like the one parental figure that you have left after your parents are gone, that's fucking traumatic. And it's really hard to talk about this stuff because I can see where Vi was coming from when we have all of the context. Powder was a child. Powder didn't have all of the context. So from Powder's point of view, I think we can, like, it's easy to see where Powder's coming from. From Vi's point of view, I think we can see where she's coming from the entire context. Both of them are in really shitty situations. And I think that trauma is the actual catalyst for everything else happening. It's like, I want to desperately prove that I can help. That's what caused Powder to really make the monkey that caused so much destruction in the warehouse. When I think about this too, I don't even think that it is really about proving to Vi that she can help. I think it's proving to herself. After Vi told Powder, stay home, we see Powder crying and she's even hitting herself in the head. When I see that, it just gives me this impression that she feels like she's not good enough. Like, I would not be surprised if Powder has some negative thoughts about, well, if I was good enough, then my sister would want to take me. If I was good enough, then my sister would accept me. If I was good enough, I could go along. These ideas of goodness. And so I really wouldn't be surprised if it isn't about Vi. And don't get me wrong, like, I think from Powder's perspective, she feels like it is about her sister. She feels like she's trying to prove her goodness to her sister. Like, look, I have this monkey. This proves that I'm good enough to you, right? But really, when we're doing something like that, we're not proving it to anybody else. We're honestly proving it to ourselves. Almost like in her own head, she doubted how helpful she was. She doubted how good she was. And that was this nagging negative voice that she had going on. And I think that is why everything in the alley was so hard. Because at that point, when Vi pushes her away, when Vi calls her a Jinx, like, it feels like it's happened not only once, but twice. And then at that point, Vi has not only told her to stay home and pushed her away, now Vi is echoing the same word of a Jinx that her siblings did. The one safe person. Vi physically left her. She tried to prove, like, look how good I am, look how helpful I am. And that wasn't good enough. And not only that, but when someone says something that feels like the same negative thoughts we already have in our own heads, that hits home so much harder. That hurts so much more because it feels like it validates the negative thoughts that we have in our heads. And so if Powder already had negative thoughts saying, I'm not good enough, and then Vi said that you're a Jinx, and basically through her actions said you're not good enough by pushing her away, I wonder if that would have hit hard or hit home so much harder because it felt like it echoed the negative thoughts that Powder could have already had. So yes, I feel like that incident in the alley was traumatic, but I feel like the reason why it was traumatic is because of what happened earlier. And sometimes that's how trauma works. It's this layer upon layer of things that happens, and it's because of the layers. That's why it's impactful. It's not just because of one singular incident. I feel like that's what we see with Powder. Because we kind of see an echo of that later on. When Powder realizes that Vi is alive, I feel like one reason why that may be so difficult and so impactful and potentially traumatic is because at that point in time for this character, she has developed a new safe person. Silco is her new safe person. Much like Vi used to be, right? Vi used to be the one safe person after their parents passed away. The closest person that she had. Don't get me wrong, she had Vander too. But Vander's like not a sibling. It didn't have the same feeling to it. Whereas Vi is an actual sibling. Silco was like the new safe person. He took care of her. But then finding out that Vi is alive and feeling like Silco lied, that feels like it would be an echo of the same thing that happened with Vi. And that makes me wonder, would one reason why that would be so difficult and so traumatic, and the reason why I keep talking about like it's trauma, would that be because maybe Powder would wonder, is Silco going to do the same thing that Vi did? Will Silco also push me away? Will he also say I'm not good enough? And I feel like that is what the entire ending of the show is really talking about, really hinting at, really echoing basically this idea of, will that happen? At least as far as Powder goes. Another thing that I think is important to talk about with Powder is psychosis. Psychosis is a very technical term. It's a very medical term. It's the kind of term that I might use, but other people may not use, and I recognize that. So let's define it. Psychosis is basically a disconnect from reality. It's kind of an umbrella term too. So underneath the umbrella of psychosis, you have things like hallucinations and delusions. Hallucinations usually include visual and auditory hallucinations. There are other types of hallucinations, but those are the most common types of hallucinations. So an auditory hallucination is hearing things that other people don't hear, and a visual hallucination is seeing things that other people don't see. A delusion is a belief in something that doesn't make sense to other people. We could also say a belief in something that isn't real. As we're talking about psychosis, I think it's important to mention that psychosis is not a diagnosis. It's more of how some things may present themselves. It's more of a symptom of something. Arcane shows Powder experiencing hallucinations and potentially delusions. Some of this is hard to tell because we can't ask this character. We can't sit Powder down and say, hey, do you actually believe this? Do you not believe this? So I'm taking some educated guesses here. Fairly early on in the show, Arcane sets up a certain aesthetic, a certain style or effect, almost this glitchiness that comes with these hallucinations, especially the visual hallucinations. It's a very visual way to show us that Powder has that disconnect from reality. We see these moments where characters have their faces like scratched out, where they're distorted, where they're stretched in different ways. Arcane really uses this effect to show that if Powder is experiencing these hallucinations over a period of time, it makes me wonder what emotional effect that would have, because they don't seem like they're great. They don't seem like they're the kind of thing that we would look at and say, yes, I want that. A lot of these hallucinations are connected to Powder's childhood trauma. First, Powder creates very visual representations of her siblings, Milo and Clagger. We see them in her hideout, if you will. But there are moments when we see through Powder's eyes, where we see that she actually sees them not as dummies or mannequins. She sees them as her siblings. And yes, I just said that like these hallucinations are not supportive and they're not like helpful or happy. And we could look at that and say, oh, well, isn't this supportive? Because she's, seeing her siblings alive. Isn't that like a happy thing? But that almost seems to me like it would be a sad reminder that they're not actually there anymore. So that right there is a visual hallucination. That is the disconnect from reality. Unfortunately, the reality is that her siblings are not alive anymore. And there are some times when we see the image of her siblings and the glitchiness together. And even when the glitchiness puts a smile on people's faces, it's very Joker-like. It's a facade of happiness, it's not real happiness. We still don't look at that and think, yes. They also use very blue tones a lot of times. I'm thinking of when Powder had the smoke flare and we see her siblings behind her. If I remember right, there were very blue tones to them. There's not this feeling of happiness. We don't usually use blue. We use color to convey symbolism. We don't usually use blue for happiness. Blue is almost for sadness, remorse, like those kinds of things. There are also a couple moments where it seems like Powder is disconnected from reality, more like delusions. One of the very first times that we saw Powder when she was an adult was when she saw a hallucination of her sister. She saw someone with pink hair and she saw her sister's face. And we saw that emotional reaction. And as the show goes on, Powder seems to have more hallucinations the more she interacts with Vi or has something to do with Vi. For example, she has that hallucination with the smoke screen, which has that actual connection to Vi. Like, the whole reason why she has that flare is because Vi told her, use this and I'll come. She uses a flare that is specifically designed for her sister to come to her, and that's when she has the hallucinations of her siblings. In the very beginning of the show, the whispers were just that. They were whispers. I'm assuming that they're whispers of her siblings. You couldn't pick out specific words. They were just background whispers. But the more that Powder interacts with her sister, this person that used to be safe and then rejected her, then pushed her away, the more these hallucinations become louder. They're not whispers anymore. They're actual voices. When she is stapling her leg together, which doesn't sound fun, like, they're actual full-on sounds, voices. You can tell what they're saying. Milo is talking to her in a very distinct way. So the more interactions that Powder has with her sister, the more vivid, the more distinct these voices get. We also have that moment where Powder saw Caitlyn and Caitlyn's face became distorted. And I think it would be very easy for Powder to interpret that as, you're taking my sister away. And not only that, but like, Powder would have grown up knowing that the enforcers took their parents away. So this idea of, you're taking my sister away, but you're an enforcer and enforcers took my parents away, I think that would be an easy connection to make. So the psychosis that we see from Powder seems to have a lot of connections to that past trauma. In general, as far as like the nature of the hallucinations, but also when they appear and how they appear, the frequency, that kind of thing. I also feel as though Powder has delusions. This is a hard thing because like we can't ask Powder what she believes is true or not. So it's hard to tell how much someone may be having a hard time with delusions when we're talking about a TV show. Putting that out there. But there are moments in the show where Powder like asks her sister, like, are you real? Which implies that she's not sure what's real or not. She also made these very physical representations of her siblings, and she talks to them as though they can respond, and they do respond. Could it be that the show is trying to portray like what someone would see if they were to walk in on her responding to her hallucinations? Or it also could be a delusion where she believes they are responding. It's, I guess, two different ways to show the concepts of psychosis. I also wonder just a little bit when Powder's talking about Vi at the end of the show, and she's saying, you never left. You were the shadows in the streets. You were the prickles on the back of my neck. I wonder if that was a way of storytelling, if that was an exaggeration, or if that was something she actually believed and that was more of a delusion. And that's what I mean when I say that delusions are kind of hard to tell sometimes, when we can't ask the person, like, do you really believe that? Or is this just a thing that you're saying? That's why I say it's hard to tell. But we can see the hallucinations that Powder was experiencing. I realize that there's a lot more to talk about with this character, which is why there's a whole other video planned. But I feel like the trauma was such an important part of almost everything else that happened to this character. And I do feel like the trauma was a catalyst for everything else. And the show focuses on that moment in the alley. I've talked about that before, and I've talked about how I disagree with that. I think from Powder's perspective, that was the most important trauma in her life. But I don't agree with that. I don't think the show agrees with that either. And my reason for saying that, as I unpin the thing I pinned earlier, is because the very first episode, the very first moment we see these characters, we see those glitches. And the show basically teaches you these glitches are associated with psychosis. These like scribbles and scratches and glitchy moments, these are a psychosis thing. The show ends up teaching us as the audience that. So then why do we have psychosis so early in the show? So that moment on the bridge when Powder lost her parents, that was before that moment in the alley with Vi. Sure, it could be a stylistic thing. They could be teaching the audience there's going to be this aesthetic. That's true. That could be what they're doing. But when they've purposefully put so much mental health into the show, I feel like what the writers are saying, is this moment of losing her parents so early set the stage for all this other trauma and the psychosis for this character. I feel like we have potentially different perspectives. I feel as though Powder believes that being pushed away by her sister in the alley is the most important moment. The thing that made her who she is, which is why that episode at the very end is titled "The Monster That You Created." I really do think that is Powder's perspective, and her perspective is valid. But when we're kids and we're growing and we're learning and we're developing, experiencing trauma at such a young age can make such a huge impact. And that really set the stage for basically everything else in Powder's life. And so I feel like that is meaningful that they put those types of glitches in there so early in the show. So I feel like potentially the most traumatic moment, and again, this is subjective, I can't actually tell for sure what is or isn't, but my guess is that the most traumatic moment in this show for Powder is the first one that we see. Losing her parents from such an early age and seeing this destruction in front of her and hearing it happen, that set the stage for everything else. That's when everything in her life changed. And maybe she blames herself for that. Maybe she feels like she lost her parents because she's a Jinx. Who knows? But that's my theory. Those are my thoughts on trauma and psychosis for this character and how they could be connected. I'm going to be doing another video on other mental health aspects with Jinx, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this video and the show of Arcane in general. And I will see you next time.